Good evening all, and welcome. Firefighters have to deal with a lot of stuff, whether it be life-risking fires, falling buildings, or the remains of car accidents, and everything in between. Their job is not easy. I hope you're ready for tonight's stories, so get comfortable and let the darkness take control. To give a bit of pretext to the situation, it all started when I moved in with my family into western Pennsylvania, in the suburbs back in 2006. Prior to this, we lived in military housing, and my folks thought it would be best for the family to move back to where my mother used to live. The area used to be an old steel town, and still has a steel mill in the area, and was built in the late 19th and early 20th century. We lived in what used to be the Italian portion of the town. Fast forward about 5 years, it's 2011 or 2012, I was part of a volunteer fire department, since one of my friends, Alan, kept saying it would be entertaining to do. I was part of the first response to a house fire. The house had been condemned for close to a year, and we assumed that some drug addict or kids got in there and caused a fire. One of my fellow firefighters noticed someone on the top floor skidding past a window, which was starting to emit smoke through it, so we proceeded to send 2 teams of 2 into the house to get them out of there. I was part of one of the teams and was tasked to search the top floor and assist in getting anyone and everyone safely out of the house. As we proceeded up to the top floor, we quickly entered the first door, which was to the left of the staircase. As we entered, I felt a cold chill on my forearm. Later, I found out my partner John also felt a cold chill on his body, and kept searching the top floor until my left foot fell through a floor. At this point, we proceeded to get everyone out the house. Several weeks after the incident, I noticed some odd things seemed to be happening to John and I. We were having very similar dreams of a gentleman, about 6 foot, olive-toned skin and black hair with green eyes. In my dream, he was dragging me out of bed. I was not able to move, and out of my room and towards the bookshelves that were to the right of my door. I kept having this dream on a nearly nightly basis, which wore me down physically and mentally. A month after these dreams started, John got into an accident. He was T-boned by a semi in his Pontiac and didn't survive. When I got to the scene and saw his car, I felt my stomach bottom out, since he became a very close friend, and felt that horrific cold chill on my right forearm, exactly where we felt it in the house fire. That night, I had the same dream, except this time, instead of the bookshelves being where they usually are, there was a big red circle with symbols, and I was being pulled in. At that point, I fell deeply into a state of paranoia and depression. I would do anything in my power to stay away from my house, the house that the fire happened in, and where John got T-boned, in fear that I would end up like John. Later I sought the help of a local psychologist to help some with John's passing, and I also enlisted an old family friend who was a practicing Wiccan to figure out what the hell was going on. Thanks in part to the advice of my family friend, the dream only occurred when I was under a lot of stress, near the house fire or the accident site. This dream ended when my family finally moved into a new house. The house was slightly newer and definitely had something in it. Nothing like the thing from before though. It felt warm, motherly, and did not haunt my dreams. I did not realize at this time this was not the end of what had been happening for 2 years at this point. I was returning from the town that my old house was in. I left my best friend's place at 11:02 p.m. To get to my new house, I have to drive a few miles on the light, windy, heavily wooded road that has hardly any houses on it. I was no more than a mile outside of town when I saw someone on the side of the road walking towards me. I slowed down just in case he walks across the road or anything, but something truly horrifying happened that still makes my skin turn ice cold. My truck just stopped, the lights went out, the engine turned off, and my phone, which had 90% battery, shut down, and the only light came from a porch at the top of the hill. The person started walking towards the front of my truck. The closer and closer he got, the more and more I could make him out. When he put his hand on the hood of my truck, it finally hit. I knew the person. About 6 foot, olive-toned skin, black hair and green eyes. It was him. I tried to scream, but couldn't make a sound. I tried to start my truck, but it would not turn over. All this happened while his hands were still on my hood, and he started to grin a horrible grin. I started to cry, not a cry of pain, but I was crying in fear of what that thing was going to do to me. I was afraid that he caused the accident with John and was going to do the same thing with me. After what felt like an eternity, he mouthed something and took his hands off the hood and proceeded to cross the road and head into the woods. As soon as he was out of sight, my truck came back to life and I drove like a madman away from town. I finally stopped at a Sheetz, a local gas station chain, and just got out of my truck. When I took one step out of my truck, I crumpled down to the ground and just shook. I could not stop shaking, and was assisted by an associate who was trying to figure out what was wrong. I left the place as soon as I could crawl back into my vehicle, and just left before paramedics arrived. I don't know how I could explain what happened. After the traumatic incident, I never saw the guy again in my dreams, but I still feel a chill go through my body every time I think about that damn grin. What was that thing? I was not a believer in the supernatural or anything like that prior to all of this occurring, but now I definitely think there is something out there, something I cannot explain, but I want to know what it is. My friend was a firefighter, and I heard this story secondhand because he refused to talk about what happened. Emphasis on was. He went out on a call regarding a house on fire. When they arrived, they started staging, and a woman was running up to him and told him that her kids were still inside, so he rushed in. It took him several minutes of searching to find the 2 kids that had hidden themselves in a closet on the 2nd floor, and they were still alive. As he wrapped his arms around them to pick them up, their flesh came off in his hands and clung to his suit. The children died before he could get them outside. He retired after that, and hasn't been the same since. The second story. Firefighter was called out to a house on fire. Later we discovered that the house was said to be foreclosed, so the owner decided that if he couldn't have the house, nobody could, so he set it on fire himself. But that isn't relevant to the story. Anyway, a group of 5 firefighters breached the building to search for survivors, including one rookie. They cleared each floor until they reached the attic, and after confirming that no one was home, they started to leave, when the floor collapsed on the far end of the room, causing superheated air to rush in. The firefighters ran out of the room, until they realized that there were only 4 of them. The rookie had managed to get his glove hooked on something, and it was yanked off, so he was left wandering around the attic in a delirious state. The group of 4 firefighters all agreed to go back into the attic, was certain death, but they couldn't leave that kid behind, so they went back up. Luckily, they managed to grab the rookie and pulling out without losing anyone, though the skin on his right forearm had melted almost off to the bone, and the rest of his skin had fused to the inside of his suit. Last I heard, he actually survived, though he required a ridiculous amount of surgeries and skin grafts to even partially recover. Moral of the story? Fire is bad, kids. So my dad is a career firefighter, and I grew up in and around the firehouse. One of the stations in the town my dad works in is, according to my dad and just about every other firefighter that's been in the station for a night or two, extremely haunted. I believe every word out of those people's mouths. The first story is from my dad. He's not one to be easily scared. They had returned from a late night run at about 3 in the morning and went into the computer room to write up the run report. He told me he felt this feeling like someone was behind him. He turned around in the chair and saw a man in a black top hat standing outside the window. The man turned and walked towards the front door. Thinking someone was there for something, since it's technically a safe place, my dad jumped up and ran straight to the door, to find the guy was gone. But as Dad went to walk back into the station, the man walked around the corner and through the front door of the station. He didn't open the door, which would have been impossible since the door is locked and requires a numerical code to open. He walked through it and disappeared. My dad said he immediately went up to his bunk room and finished the report in the morning because he was so freaked out. The next story comes from the medic my dad worked with. One night, she was watching a horror movie with my dad. At one of the jump scares, they both heard the front door get kicked and hit the inside wall, then slam shut. The medic, thinking my dad was playing a trick on her, turned to yell at him for scaring her, only to see him white as a sheet. Both freaked out at this point. They hopped up to see if one of the other guys was screwing with them. My dad went to check the door, and the medic went upstairs to see if anyone was missing. Everyone was upstairs asking who the hell slammed the door. My dad comes upstairs with no explanation as to how the hell that happened. The next story comes from the battalion chief, who was at the time a lieutenant. This guy's scary. He's huge, he's bald, and is 100% no nonsense. And he absolutely refused to believe any ghost stories from the station. So the guys dared him to stay downstairs until 2 a.m. He did, and nothing out of the ordinary happened. 2 a.m. comes around, he gets up, turns the TV off, turns the lights off, and gets to the second step, and hears a woman whisper in his ear, "He's finally going to bed." Everyone was in bed, and the only female on the department at the time was not on shift. The guys said they thought he was going to collapse from fright when he got to the top of the steps. It took 20 minutes to calm him down, so they could get the story out of him. He said he felt the breaths from the woman speaking on his ear. He still barely speaks of it, and if he does, he gets visibly freaked out. But by far the most interesting story from this station is this one. So each shift has their own refrigerator, and they get locked as each shift leaves because, well, firefighters steal food from each other. C shift was known to steal food constantly. They'd eat entirely from the other two shifts' fridges, forcing A and B shift to constantly go grocery shopping. Well, apparently, the entity, ghost, or whatever you want to call it, got tired of C shift stealing everyone's food, and one morning, when A shift came in to relieve C shift, they found C shift's refrigerator and freezer wide open, with all of the food in the trash can. No one is quite sure how it happened, but both shifts swear on it. Other stuff would happen. PASS devices would go off in the middle of the night for no reason. Boots would be pulled out of bunker pants, which is infuriating for firefighters. They could hear the workout equipment being used at all hours, and occasionally see a man standing in the bay, staring at the trucks, only for him to disappear. Just weird stuff like that. It's a really cool firehouse, but it certainly has that feeling like you are not alone. My dad is a firefighter. He responded to a case. The girl was 5 years old, and the father would beat her, and the mother would neglect her. The parents split, and the abusive father took her and married an even more aggressive stepmother when the child turned 4. The father admitted to beating the child at least once a day because she did things like have bathroom accidents. They never taught her properly how to use the bathroom, you see. They used bats, belts, and anything that was within arm's reach. The child was malnourished and neglected, with healing bruises and fresh bruises. 3 days prior to her death, the couple refused to clothe and bathe her, leaving the child to live in her own feces. The child's last day was spent in her room, unfurnished, and covered in her own feces. Beaten, then left unattended as the couple went to work. Upon returning, her dad whipped her with a belt for the last time. When my dad responded, he went to a room layered with feces with blood splattered on the wall, and the floor where the girl had laid still, covered in her own blood and vomit, while experiencing seizures due to the trauma. As a first responder, it was my dad's duty to save her. He gave her CPR frantically, trying to do everything in his power to save her life, as if the child was his own. There was nothing he could do but watch her die slowly as he held her. Later investigations found that the child had been whipped, then hit in her chest, knocking her to the ground. The father then proceeded to stomp on her chest and head, causing her ribs to break, along with brain bleeding and a dislocated shoulder. Although my state ended the death penalty in 1957, the crime had occurred on federal property, and thus the father was up for the death penalty. This caused the trial to drag on for 10 years. For each of those years, my father deteriorated in his mental state and developed alcohol abuse, later leading up to a few small domestic violent cases. He suffers from PTSD now, and the father I grew up with was no longer present. Hats off to all of you for keeping your sanity. While working as a wildland firefighter, our crew was on a fire deep in New Mexico. With that profession, you spend a lot of time on your feet and doing a lot of manual labor with little sleep. On the incident maps, it's common to make notations of areas that are considered sensitive. This can range from areas with suspected/known endangered species to known pot farms and Native American land with cultural significance. So, we were late into our shift and can't even recall what day we were on, because typical assignments can last anywhere between 14 to 28 days depending on need for resources. We were working with a Native American crew because our division went through culturally sensitive land. Everything was going great. Darkness fell, and it was coming up on break time eventually. We were all dead tired, sucking in smoke all day with little sleep. That's totally normal. Fire was pretty much out in our area, minus a few hot spots that needed mopping up. As I was sitting against a tree, all of our normal radio traffic turned to nothing but static, which is common in the areas out there. Fighting the urge to sleep, I got one of those moments that just wakes you up, like when you wake from a dream when you're falling. It was like that, but there were these figures similar to the ghost of Obi-Wan. It's like they would walk behind a tree and disappear. Nobody else saw it, but I've heard similar stories before, and I'm not really a person who believes in ghosts or the paranormal. I like to think it was real, but I do my best to tell myself that it was just a hallucination from lack of sleep. But I guess I'll never know. I'm a firefighter/EMT, and I've seen a lot. The very worst was when I was on the job less than a year, and got a call from a 3-month-old not breathing. We go into the house, and it's utter chaos. The mother is holding the child, and she's crying and screaming. Her parents are then crying and screaming. The house is absolute madness. I rip the child from the mother's grip and check for a pulse. The LT is trying to get information and clear the room. I'm barking orders at my partners to get him out of the shell-shock state, and I'm holding the baby with my left arm, cradling her head with my hands, and start chest compressions. While I'm doing this, a bloody foam comes out of her mouth. The only thing I can think of is what the hell? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the paramedics arrive on scene, and I hand the child over to them. They take her out of the ambulance to continue there. When I finally decompress, I find that the info the LT got was that it was the grandparents' house. The daughter, mother, and her husband were arguing, so she was staying there a few days. They had no crib, so the mother and baby slept in the same bed. The mother rolled over onto the baby and suffocated her. When someone is suffocated, your lungs fill with foam, then mix with blood from your lungs. Hence the bloody foam. I had nightmares for a year as a result of this call. I'm a firefighter working with law enforcement, and we got a call for a suicide attempt. We have a 6'1" Russian woman in amazing shape that got hammered drunk and cut her left arm to shreds. We try and hold her down, but she is crazy strong and super flexible. So I'm holding that bleeding left arm, and my fingers slide into the open cut of her arm. I have gloves on, but Jesus Christ, it's creepy. And she twists her arm around, trying to get free. She starts screaming, "My victory will be glorious," and cackling like some kind of satanic animal. So I'm struggling to get this arm tied down, and suddenly she just stops, looks me dead in the eyes and says, "Where did you get those green eyes?" At this point she's on a stretcher, with 6 to 8 cops and firefighters holding her down. Some of the cops didn't have gloves on, and they didn't want to mess with that bloody left arm. She slowly overcomes my strength, and in slow motion reaches for my zipper of my pants. I can't stop her, and my hands are covered in blood. She manages to unzip them, but now I have my arse up against the wall of the ambulance, so she can only get the tip of her fingers in my pants as she's straining to reach inside. We finally did get her tied down, but Jesus, it's one of the most memorable calls I've ever had. I've gone on stuff way worse than this, but that always sticks in my mind, as my fingers twisted around inside someone's arm. For context, I've been a junior firefighter for a little over a year now, and I've been working at a very old and arguably haunted firehouse. Junior firefighters can go on calls, however we are obviously not interior firefighters. We provide exterior support and scavenge for anything that survived the fire when it's been put out. My first call happened 3 months into my career. I was excited and nervous and rode with the chaplain, another junior, and 3 interior firefighters, not including those in the front seats, one of whom I didn't recognize. I thought this was because there were still people I hadn't met, and that was true. I still only knew a handful of people at the station, so I sat in the extra seat that you have to pull down. Also, on the truck and engine, we put on sound cancelling headsets to drown out the loud siren to help us communicate. They're a bit weird, and you have to hold the microphone for less than half an inch from your mouth to talk and be heard. On the way, The other juniors said something and I couldn't hear it, so I assumed it was just something about being my first call. We arrived on scene, and the first thing I noticed after the fire was the crowd. So me and the other junior provided crowd control, while the engine showed up with exterior firefighters. I honestly don't remember much from this. The prior excitement had boiled into fear and anxiety. The 3 interior firefighters went in, and truth be told, the fire wasn't all that bad in hindsight. However, I would see much worse fires. Anyway, I'm not sure how much time passed, but before I knew it, the fire was still burning, and 2 of the interior fighters were back outside, and their air cylinders had run out. Then I remembered the 3rd guy, and asked the other junior how long the guy sitting across from me on the truck had been at the station, as he seemed to have great composure and could maintain calm breathing in a fire. I had only seen him in turnout gear, so I didn't know his body type. The other junior looked at me and said, "We only had 2 interior firefighters on this call with us. I told you on our way there that you don't need to sit in the spare seat." Confused, I approached the chaplain and asked him if we had 3 interiors on the truck with us. He said no. When the fire was put out, we went inside and did our thing. I found no trace of another firefighter, and when we got back to the station, I asked the chief about the man. I gave a good description, I think, and the chief gave me a confused but interested stare. He brought me to the off-duty room upstairs and showed me a picture on the wall and pointed to a firefighter in his turnout gear, along with a much younger chief, and asked me if that was the man I saw. It was, and he told me this. He told me his name, that he passed away from lung cancer in 2002. A lot of firefighters die this way, sadly, and I doubt he was the only one to die this way at our station. I believe he was just watching over me on my first call, as I'm sure he did with the other junior. My dad and one of his best friends were volunteer firefighters in the 90s, and my dad still is, with over 40 years of active service at age 63. His station got a run called in for a bad accident. A semi-truck fully loaded with sugar beets had run a red and absolutely destroyed the Geo Metro that had entered the intersection. At this point in time, the way to call procedure was set up was that there were designated groups of guys who would go to the station to get the actual fire trucks, and the other guys would carry their turncoat gear in their own vehicles and go straight to the scene. The intersection that this accident occurred at happened to be the closest major intersection to both my house as well as my dad's friend's house, so they were both the first 2 guys on the scene. Turned out the woman who was driving the car that got hit was my dad's friend's mother. He arrived and found his own mother decapitated in what was left of her car, and policy about getting to the station first was revised as well. I had an early morning call for a vehicle accident over the side of a highway and into a body of water. We arrived on scene to find a man screaming about sliding off the road. He was driving his kids to school, and on his way to work, he lost control of the vehicle on the icy road. Dad was able to unbuckle himself, and his 2 sons, 5 and 7 years old. However, he was unable to pull them out because of all the water rushing in. The divers got onto the scene and determined the vehicle was just about 10 feet underwater. While the divers went down, we quickly rigged up a janky rescue system to haul the kids up once they were pulled out of the vehicle by the divers. The first child who came out was the older one and was brought up in a rescue litter, and my partner grabbed him and ran to the ambulance with a medic. The second child was being walked up the cliffs by a police officer who had him in one arm and was doing chest compressions as he was walking up the rocks. As he got to the top, he stretched out his arm and picked up the child from him. I laid the boy on the top of the gurney and he was brought into the ambulance. We brought him to the ambulance, and they worked the child for about 15 minutes or so. Eventually, the paramedics pronounced both children in the back of their ambulances. Everyone did everything they could. It was difficult, it really was. Even though I knew as soon as the child was handed to me, he had already perished. They were underwater for at least 15 minutes. More than enough time for any kid of a medical miracle. This is by far the single worst call of my career. I've only been doing this job for about 6 years now, and I hope that I never experience anything like it again, even though it's a strong possibility. The light side of this story to me is how willing everyone was to help. Everyone there gave all they had in hopes for saving these 2 boys. My stepdad is a firefighter, and he told this story to me and my sister about 5 years ago, and it has stuck with me. As a firefighter, he also attends car crashes to help cut people out. The story he told us was that he was called to a lorry and car collision, which never ends well. In the car there were 3 adults and 1 young girl of 6 or 7. If memory serves, the family friend was driving with the others in the back, and the little girl was in the middle back seat. They crashed into a lorry, and the car went under it, decapitating all the adults but missing the girl. She had to sit in the car surrounded by the decapitating bodies of her family and friends for around 4 hours before they could get her out. He also told us about how when brains are splattered across the windscreen, it reminds him of raw mince. I guess when you deal with that stuff a lot, you kind of grow immune to it. And for those of you who are unaware, a lorry is a British term for a truck. I am a volunteer firefighter. Back in 2000, we had a call to go to a local park to render first aid assistance. We arrived at the park, and within about 5 minutes we found a 12-year-old girl unconscious with no pulse, and 5 of her friends standing around screaming and crying. We performed CPR on the girl for 15 minutes until the first ambulance arrived, and then assisted with the ambo for another 30 until the second one arrived, which was the area paramedic unit for children. By this stage we had flat batteries on 2 defibrillators and no signs of life. Unfortunately, at this moment the girl's mother arrived, in time to see us move the girl into the ambulance while still undergoing CPR. Unfortunately, the girl did not respond to the first aid and was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. It was not a pleasant experience to work on someone so young. Until this day, I can still remember her eyes. I am a firefighter, and this was the worst one for me. We run on a difficulty breathing call. I arrive and find myself having a hard time breathing due to the smell of crab. I see the patient, who seems to be high as balls. We stand her up, and her pants are clearly full of shit. We walk her to the ambulance, and I begin to start an IV on her. I grab her arm and find a vein, and as usual, I place it in my lap. The paramedic shouts at me to wait, and then throws a sheet into my lap. She had shit all over her hands and arms that I hadn't spotted earlier. She'd been playing in the shit. And then I saw her smile. Please, don't do meth. I once responded to an emergency call on base. The elevator was broken, so I had to run up 8 flights of steps, and my bulletproof vest constricted my breathing a bit. So by the time I got to the doors, I was very out of breath. The call was a vague medical emergency, where the RP was crying and kept saying they needed an ambulance. The dispatcher had called ahead, and the barracks manager was awaiting with a key. We opened the door to find a young seaman with his pants and underwear around his ankles, surrounded by pornography and lube on the floor. He was just standing there on his tiptoes, tears running down his face and softly moaning. I walked over to him, only to realise the doorknob to his bathroom was up his arse and still attached to the door. Dumbfounded, I looked at him expectantly as he said, "I backed up to it by accident." Being already out of breath, I had to sit down as the laughter began. When the EMS arrived, they couldn't believe it either. They had to end up cutting the door around the knob and transporting him with the doorknob still up his arse. As it was, they had to take him down 8 flights of steps. With each bump down, the doorknob would move and he would yelp. By the 5th floor, it wasn't funny anymore. I was on a junior firefighter program when I was 15 in my small town. I'm talking really small, with roughly 400 people. One night, a guy was heading home drunk in his pickup truck, flipped the truck and wasn't wearing his seatbelt. While the truck was in the air, he managed to hang halfway out of his side window, and the truck landed on the side and slid for about 100 feet. So there were body parts and car parts everywhere. Being a small town in the middle of BFE, there's no cleanup crew. Who do they call to clean it up? The fire department. I'm walking around at night with a flashlight, rubber gloves, and a bag, picking up pieces of this drunk guy. Last year, we got one where a guy was DUI and had been pulled over. The cop stepped out of his car and the dude took off. He blew a red light going really fast and hit 2 15-year-old boys that were walking home after gentlemanly escorting a pair of females back to their homes. They were hit so hard they flew over 100 feet through the air from the crosswalk and left bloody skid marks on the ground. Their jackets, shoes, and I think a hat were strewn around, leaving a trail behind their flight path. One boy was alive when the EMS got there. The other was pronounced dead on arrival. We, the fire department, got to hold tarps up to protect the delicate eyes of the public view from seeing a dead body, and after 4 cold hours and a lot of coffee, load the body up for the coroner. He looked like a nice kid with an honest face. From what I could see of it, he had bled substantially through his scalp, eyes and mouth and nose, and a pool of streaming blood collected by the curb. His bones were thoroughly broken, and part of his knee was showing through the skin. The state police and coroner took pictures and did all the stuff with spray paint and the numbers that you thought were just for TV. After all was said and done, we just had to spray the blood off the street and into the gutter. I see the marks and memorial every day, because it was just at the end of my street. Sometimes I'll see young people run across the same intersection before the light changes and while I'm driving, and it makes me choke on my stomach. Unfortunately, the other boy died en route to the hospital. The perpetrator was caught. I hope he never sees the light of day. My brother was a fire cadet in a small town. One night in June, there was a particularly strong storm system rolling through, so the volunteer fire department was sent out to storm spot, i.e. look for and report any walls of clouds and tornadoes as was customary. While out spotting, a call came that cows were running loose into the street, needing to assemble a group of men quickly to round them up. The owner had called the fire department. The fire department went over to the farm, my brother included, and trapezed around in this horrific thunderstorm chasing cows in the dark. The cows had gotten loose because they stampeded through the fence, making securing them all the more difficult. The reason for the stampede? There was a bear. So my brother, who has been treated for anxiety all his life, found himself facing a tornado, lightning, a bear and scared cows all at once in the dark. He said he sort of OD'd and became very zen about the whole scenario. It was really the turning point for him in getting his anxiety under control. My dad has been a lieutenant firefighter for the past 23 years, and he always says that he can handle almost any medical call, except for when it involves kids. One day, he got a medical about an injured kid at the local elementary school, and rushed over to take care of him. In transit, they find out the kid had been hit in the throat by a football whilst trying to block a punt at recess, and he had stopped breathing. My dad's station was the first to arrive on the scene, and being the most experienced EMT in the crew, he was the first to perform CPR and place the IV on the kid. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough, and the kid passed in my father's arms. It's something that he has lived with and tried to forget for 2 years now. So far in all his years of serving and seeing the plethora of mutilated bodies that he's seen, that was the only day that he has come home and taken the rest of the day off. Fortunately, the fire department did provide counselling, which he took advantage of, and is much better today. But it is something that will still always be there. I had been a firefighter for 20 years, and a friend of my son's had decided to join the force. I personally saw it as my task to mentor Glenn, so that he could become a great firefighter, and one who of course abided all safety procedures. It was our very first call. Glenn had been trained properly and knew everything in and out regarding safety. We were suited up and got to the fire. It wasn't good. It was 4 buildings, all burning, and multiple other fire departments had been called from the area as it was that bad. We ran in because we knew that there were people on the inside who needed help. The house that we went into was desperately close to collapsing, but there were a family upstairs, and by our reckoning we still had time to get them in and out if we were quick enough. Glenn came in with us, although he wasn't supposed to. We only found this out too late though. We went in and tried grabbing everyone we could and telling the rest to try their best to come out. We managed to get them out without the building collapsing, and we thankfully all made it out, except for Glenn. He had heard something that we had not. A mother said that her daughter was sleeping upstairs in the attic room, and Glenn, seeing us all occupied, must have thought himself the hero and ran upstairs for that baby. Unfortunately though, we never did see Glenn again. That fire raged and Glenn never made it out, along with the baby. It's a very, very sad case, and I always feel responsible for him going inside. We told him so many times to stick to protocol. I'm not sure why he wanted to be the hero. He was so young as well. My son didn't take it well, but doesn't blame me for his passing. I still hold it in my heart though, and feel that there could have been something I should have done. When I noticed he was up there, I should have kicked him out straight away, but in the panic and in the heat of the moment, I just expected him to do it anyway. Rest in peace, Glenn. Thank you for your service. A lot of stuff happened in the firehouse over 2 or 3 months ago. When all of this stuff happened, my friends and I were 16 to 18 years old. I've forgotten some stuff, but here's a few things I remember. 1. 3 of us were hanging out in the meeting room when we hear an old woman say, "Hello?" 3 times. The first time she said it, I thought it was the scanner and laughed because I figured someone at dispatch was messing around. The second time she said it, I walked closer to the scanner. The third time, I was close enough to realize it definitely wasn't the scanner. 2. The meeting room had a pool table. My friend and I decided to have a 101 game tournament to decide who was the better player. We would play for an hour or 2 every day after school. One day, we finished playing and started walking out of the meeting room and into the garage. He hit the light switch near the door, but only half the lights went out. The other lights were controlled by a light switch on the wall halfway into the room. I walked back to turn off the lights as we continued whatever conversation we were having. I stood near the switch as we continued to talk, when from the garage we heard a woman scream her head off. We ran out of the firehouse at full speed. That was one of the first things I experienced, but not the first. There was a woman at the firehouse that hated me and my friends because we were young and hung out there a lot. She would have been my great arch nemesis if she wasn't such an idiot. Anyway, she used to stop by the firehouse often. Not as much as we did, but a few times a week. A couple of us used to joke that we should hide our cars and then hide in the firehouse and scare the shit out of her. One day I went to the firehouse with a friend who wasn't a firefighter, and as we were walking towards the building, we both saw someone in a white hat run by one of the windows. We both stopped in our tracks. I started laughing and told her that someone was trying to mess with us. Before going into the building, I ran around into the back of the firehouse to see if that's where the other guys parked their cars. No cars were there. We walked into the garage and looked everywhere. I was on my toes the entire time, waiting for someone to jump out at me and scare me. It was an hour before I let my guard down. No one was in that place. 4. A lot of shit happened in this place. It used to take me up to 45 minutes to go through all the shit that happened when telling someone else. Near the back of the garage was a supply closet that was locked. We used to hang out near there and smoke cigarettes in the firehouse. 2 brothers from a different fire company were hanging out with me, and we told them all of the shit that happened. When we got to the end of the story, you could tell neither of them believed us. One, who laughed at most of what we said, started walking towards the front of the garage. The other was sitting on the back of one of the trucks. As I continued to say, "I swear this is true," or something along those lines, a loud noise came from the locked closet. The walking dude stopped dead in his tracks. The guy on the truck turned white, and I jumped up yelling, "I told you!" Since we were there all of the time, we knew where they hid the keys to the closet. We grabbed the keys, opened the door, and found everything sitting up in shelves, just like it always is. 5. On the other side of the locked supply closet, there was a small room where we kept a bunch of tools. There are 7 or 8 of us hanging out near there one night, just like the last story, and we heard a noise come from the room. Someone tried to open the door. It opened about a quarter of the way and then stopped, kind of like someone pushed back on it. We took off running. As I got near the front of the garage, I looked over my shoulder and saw one of my friends in the Karate Kid crane position. He looked over his shoulder, realized he was by himself, and then ran away. After we stopped laughing about it, we went back to the door, opening it slowly. A mop had fallen and lodged itself behind the door. It only appeared that the door was being pushed back because the first guy opened the door quickly. Not so ghostly, but it was funny. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's video. It's the first time I've done these kind of stories, firefighter stories, and it's good. I really enjoyed recording the video. I hope you guys did as well. A nice mix of paranormal and other stuff as well. That's what I like. I hope you guys enjoyed it too. If you did, please don't forget to drop that like and leave a comment. I do post every night, so why not subscribe and hit the little bell icon? It really helps me out, and you can enjoy content every night. If there's a story you wish to share, right now I'd really appreciate stories more than ever, so feel free to send them to my Reddit or my email. Both are absolutely fine, just please be sure to include plenty of punctuation, paragraphing, and detail. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.